a small red fruit growing wild along roadsides and hedgerows across the Northern Hemisphere, contains more vitamin C per gram than almost any commonly available food. In fresh form, it delivers concentrations 20 to 40 times higher than an orange. It ripens in autumn after the first frost and can be harvested by hand without tools, without orchards, without irrigation. For centuries, northern communities relied on it to survive winters that no citrus could reach. During the Second World War, when German U-boats cut off fruit imports to Britain, the government sent schoolchildren into the countryside to gather it by the ton. Within a generation, the knowledge of how to find it, how to prepare it, and why it mattered had nearly vanished. There is a fruit that grows where oranges cannot survive. It appears in late autumn, after the leaves have fallen, clinging to thorned branches in clusters of red and orange. It requires no cultivation, no fertilizer, no protection from frost. It grows wild across northern Europe, Scandinavia, Russia, and North America. On hillsides, along fence lines, at the edges of forests, in places that no farmer would bother to tend. And gram for gram, in its fresh state, it contains more vitamin C than almost any fruit commonly eaten today. The comparison is not subtle. Analyses conducted across the 20th century consistently found concentrations 20 to 40 times higher than those in oranges. The exact ratio varies with species, ripeness, and preparation, but the magnitude does not. This is not a marginal difference. This is a different category of nutrient density. For populations living in northern latitudes, where winters lasted 6 months, where fresh produce was unavailable from November to April, where the diseases of deficiency killed more reliably than famine, this fruit was not optional. It was survival. And then, within a single century, it was forgotten. Not because it stopped growing, not because it became toxic or unreliable, not because a better alternative was discovered. It was forgotten because the systems that distribute food changed, and this fruit did not fit the new systems. The knowledge of this fruit is ancient. In Scandinavia, where the growing season ends early and winter arrives without mercy, communities learned to harvest the small red fruits before snow buried the bushes. They dried them, they boiled them into soups, they pressed them into preserves that could last through the dark months when nothing else grew. Swedish households, as late as the early 20th century, still prepared a traditional soup from these fruits, a tart, slightly sweet dish served warm, rich in the nutrients that kept northern bodies functioning through months of cold and darkness. The recipe required no imported ingredients. The fruit grew on wild bushes that asked for nothing and gave generously. In the British Isles, the same plant grew along hedgerows, the tangled borders between fields that had been planted centuries earlier to mark property lines and contain livestock. Farmers knew the fruit was there. Rural communities picked it when other foods ran short. But it was never systematized, never cultivated at scale, never treated as anything more than a supplement to the real diet of grains and meat. The indigenous peoples of North America knew it too. Across the northern plains and into the boreal forests, tribes harvested the fruit in autumn, drying it for winter use, mixing it with dried meat and fat to create preserved foods that could sustain hunters through months of travel. The plant was not rare. It was not hidden. It grew everywhere the winters were harsh enough to kill less resilient species. What these scattered populations understood, without laboratories, without nutritional science, without any formal analysis, was that eating this fruit through the winter kept people healthy in ways that other preserved foods did not. The bleeding gums, the loosening teeth, the wounds that refused to heal, the fatigue that deepened into death. These symptoms were less common in communities that remembered to harvest the autumn fruit. They did not know the word for what the fruit contained. They did not need to. By the 16th and 17th centuries, European physicians had begun documenting the disease that sailors feared more than storms. On long voyages, when fresh provisions ran out and crews subsisted on hardtack and salt meat, men began to sicken. Their gums swelled and bled. Old wounds reopened, bones ached. Death came slowly, over weeks or months, and no one understood why. The cure, when it was eventually identified, was fresh food, specifically fruits and vegetables that we now know contain vitamin C. Citrus became famous for this. Limes gave British sailors their nickname. Lemons were stocked on ships crossing the Atlantic. But citrus could not grow in Northern Europe. It had to be imported at great expense from Mediterranean countries or tropical colonies. For populations that could not afford imports, that lived far from ports, that had no access to global trade, the small red fruit growing on wild bushes remained the only reliable source of what their bodies needed. And then came the 20th century. In 1941, Britain was at war, and the war was going badly. German submarines patrolled the Atlantic, sinking supply ships with terrible efficiency. The island nation, dependent on imports for much of its food, faced shortages that threatened not just comfort, but survival. Citrus fruits, imported from Spain and the Americas, became nearly impossible to obtain. Oranges disappeared from shops. Vitamin C deficiency, the ancient killer, began to seem possible again. The Ministry of Health recognized the danger, and someone remembered the hedgerows. The government organized a national campaign. Volunteers, many of them children, released from school for the purpose, were sent into the countryside to harvest the small red fruits that grew wild across Britain. Collection points were established. Tons of fruit were gathered, processed into syrup, and distributed to children and pregnant women as a vitamin supplement. It worked. The syrup provided the vitamin C that imported oranges could not. The crisis was averted, not through global trade or industrial production, but through a return to knowledge that rural communities had never entirely lost. And then the war ended. Imports resumed. Oranges reappeared in shops. The syrup program was phased out. Within a generation, the children who had gathered the fruit grew into adults who bought their vitamin C in pill form or squeezed it from imported citrus. The hedgerows still bloomed. The bushes still fruited every autumn. But fewer and fewer people bothered to harvest them. The fruit did not disappear because it failed. It disappeared because something easier took its place. Processing was part of the problem. The fruit, unlike an orange, cannot simply be peeled and eaten. Inside each small red shell surrounding the seeds are fine hairs that irritate the mouth and digestive tract. Traditional preparation required slicing the fruit open, scraping out the seeds and hairs, and cooking or drying what remained. The work was tedious. It could not be mechanized without destroying the delicate flesh. Storage was another obstacle. Fresh, the fruit lasts only days before softening and spoiling. Dried, it loses a significant portion of its vitamin content. Syrup and preserves retain more nutrients, but require sugar and processing time. None of these forms fit the model of modern food distribution, the expectation that products will be uniform, shelf-stable, and available year-round. And there was the deeper problem of perception. By the late 20th century, the fruit had become associated with poverty, with wartime desperation, with a past that modern consumers preferred to forget. It grew wild, which meant it was not serious. It required work, which meant it was not convenient. It had no brand, no marketing, no place in supermarkets organized around imported produce and packaged goods. The hedgerows still fruited. The fruit still contained what it had always contained. But the systems that moved food from field to table had no place for something that could not be shipped across oceans, could not be stored in warehouses, could not be standardized into identical units for sale. The fruit was not rejected because it was inadequate. It was rejected because adequacy was not the criterion. Modern analysis has confirmed what northern communities understood through centuries of practice. The vitamin C content of this fruit is not merely high, it is exceptional. Fresh specimens contain concentrations that dwarf those of citrus fruits. Even after drying, even after processing into powder or syrup, meaningful amounts remain. The fruit also contains compounds beyond vitamin C: flavonoids, carotenoids, polyphenols, antioxidants that contemporary research associates with reduced oxidative stress and cellular protection. The fiber content is substantial. The fruit supports digestion in ways that refined supplements cannot replicate. It delivers nutrients in a matrix of plant tissue, as human bodies evolve to receive them, rather than in isolated chemical form. And the plant itself requires almost nothing to grow. It tolerates poor soil. It tolerates cold that would kill citrus trees outright. It tolerates drought once established. drawing moisture from roots that reach deeper than its modest size suggests. It grows without irrigation, without fertilization, without pesticides. It fruits reliably, year after year, whether or not anyone tends it. In an era of climate uncertainty, of shifting growing seasons and failing harvests, the value of plants that ask for little and give much is becoming harder to ignore. This is not a tropical crop vulnerable to frost. This is not a delicate cultivar requiring controlled conditions. This is a survivor, adapted to environments where survival is not guaranteed. The bushes still grow along roadsides in Scandinavia. They still line the hedgerows of Britain. They still cover hillsides in the northern United States and Canada, in Russia, in the mountainous regions of Central Asia. Every autumn, they fruit. Every autumn, the birds take some. The rest falls to the ground, unharvested, and rots. The fruit is called the rose hip. It is the seed pod of the rose plant, the swollen structure that remains after the petals have fallen, containing the seeds from which new roses might grow. Every rose produces them, though the wild species and the rugosa varieties produce the largest and most abundant hips, the ones most suitable for harvest. They ripen in autumn, typically after the first frost, which softens their flesh and concentrates their sugars. They can be identified easily: small, oval or round, red or orange, growing in clusters at the ends of thorned branches. They remain on the bush through early winter, available to anyone who knows to look. For those who wish to grow them, the requirements are minimal. Rose bushes tolerate poor soil, cold winters, and summer drought. They grow on hillsides, in coastal areas, in neglected corners of gardens. The rugosa rose, in particular, produces abundant large hips and thrives in sandy, salty, or otherwise difficult conditions. A single established bush can yield pounds of fruit each autumn, year after year, for decades. Harvesting is done by hand after frost, when the hips are soft but not yet wrinkled. Processing remains what it has always been: cutting, seeding, removing the irritating hairs that line the interior. The flesh can be dried, cooked into syrup, simmered into jam, or steeped as tea. The work is slow. It cannot be rushed. The bushes are still there. Along the hedgerows of England, where schoolchildren gathered them 80 years ago. Along the roadsides of Sweden, where grandmothers still remember the soup. Along fence lines in New England and the Pacific Northwest, in the mountains of Colorado, in the Canadian provinces where winter comes early and stays long. The vitamin C is still there, the antioxidants, the fiber, the quiet, persistent value of a fruit that asks for nothing and offers more than most cultivated crops can match. The knowledge was not lost, it was set aside, and the rose hips are still waiting,